Hi, in this particular module, we'll be covering unique union negotiation situations. As you've been studying under the National Labor Relations Act or possibly even under public sector statutes, negotiations can occur in a lot of different traditional formats. However, there are some unique situations that can occur when it comes to contract negotiations. What I'd like to do is cover a number of those different types of special topics. One is first-time labor contracts. Typically, after a union petitions for certification and achieves certification as being the duly authorized third-party representative of the members of the union, then comes the calling for negotiating a contract, and typically that will come from the union, typically from a business agent from that particular union. And it tends to be a long process, although labor advocates would like to believe that it can be more truncated. But when you think about it, the first time union elected, first time union leaders come to the table to negotiate a contract with representatives of management, all sides of which likely have little, if any, union experience. It can tend to take quite a bit of time to move through the various different types of proposals that are made by either side. But typically it's the lack of experience with unions on either side, whether they be union local leaders or members of the management bargaining team. Typically it comes down to the business agent on the union side to provide the technical savvy, if you will. And oftentimes employers will rely upon outside legal counsel, for example, attorneys at various labor law firms to assist with those types of negotiations. A second form or alternative to traditional based bargaining would be what is typically called interest-based bargaining or joint process or win-win negotiations, where the different sides, the union and the management team, basically engage in not so much the exchange of proposals as much as establishing interests in what their particular wants might be when it comes to the negotiation process, and moving through discussions around those interests before really trying to firm up mutual understandings in the form of proposals or provisions that they can possibly tentatively agree to. Oftentimes these joint process or interest-based bargaining processes work best if there is a facilitator, a mediator possibly. Oftentimes commissioners from the Federal Mediation and Commission Service are always at the ready and are well trained in facilitating interest-based or joint process bargaining processes. Sometimes situations may call to extend a contract that otherwise has an expiration date. Such factors may be operationally based, financially based, availability of personnel to negotiate the contract, for a variety of reasons. But the point is that just because a contract has an expiration date does not mean that the parties cannot agree to an extension of that contract. Oftentimes it's just a matter of the union leadership and management representatives to formalize in writing the terms and conditions of that expiration and how long it will be and under what conditions negotiations would re-engage at some point in the future. Another special situation that can occur is what's referred to as effects bargaining. If during the term of the collective bargaining agreement, management of the company wished to make some changes or some emergent situation had occurred that it wasn't anticipated at the time that the collective bargaining was agreed to, it would be the obligation of the employer management to meet with what we call meet and confer with representatives from the union membership. The calling for this is typically by the union. The employer is under no obligation to invite union members to engage in effects bargaining. However, once the union is put on notice of the changes, then the union has the right to call for effects bargaining to be able to present information that they think it may be helpful in the decision-making process for the decisions that the management of the company might be considering. However, because it is meet and confer, the management, the employer, is only obligated to consider the information that the union provides, and it does not require bargaining to impasse. Another special situation is referred to as interim bargaining, or bargaining as a result of reopener clauses, possibly that are contained in a collective bargaining agreement. And it's not illegal if the parties mutually agree that they wish to negotiate over a particular subject of bargaining during the term of the labor agreement, even though that labor agreement has not yet expired. But typically, both parties would have to agree in engaging in negotiations over whatever the particular interest might be, typically of the union or possibly the employer organization as well. The arena of mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures brings with it a lot of unique situations associated with change in control, change in ownership, companies acquired, companies divested, and if those particular companies have unions in certain operations or particular components of the business units, then the typical question is what happens to the collective bargaining agreement. And actually, if the collective bargaining agreement has scripted into it a provision, what typically is called a successorship clause or successorship provisions, then that question is typically answered in terms of what happens to the collective bargaining agreement given a change in control. In some particular situations, however, there could be a change in control, change in ownership, and the union remains and by no means is decertified. However, there could be a calling for negotiation of an entirely brand new collective bargaining agreement as if it were a first-time contract. There are some particular legalities associated with the type of transaction that an acquisition may occur. For example, if it's a stock acquisition, one company buys all the stock of another company in its entirety. Typically, the acquiring company will take on both the union as well as the exact same collective bargaining agreement and continue on with terms and conditions as negotiated. However, in the event of, say, for an example, bankruptcy, and it's an asset acquisition out of bankruptcy, and a particular entity is just simply acquiring various assets of a former company, then typically there is no union nor any collective bargaining agreement associated with asset purchases. Multi-employer bargaining brings with it a unique venue where numerous corporations and companies within a particular industry segment come together and negotiate with unions on a national level. The best example of this, for example, would be within the mine coal industry, where the Bituminous Coal Operators of America basically consists of a consortium of the majority of all the major coal companies in the United States. And that entity in and of itself will negotiate with collective representatives across all the various coal mining entities within those corporations to negotiate terms and conditions of contracts. And this is really akin to consortiums of companies and consortiums of local unions, all in the same union in the same industry, that come together to negotiate collectively over contracts which would apply to all the companies and the unions within. Unlike what I just discussed with respect to consortium negotiation. It's not uncommon for very large corporations to also have master agreements, if you will, across various either similar or different unions within their enterprise. Organizations such as General Electric or Honeywell are good examples where basically they can have a variety of different unions in different industrial segments of their business, but at a master level, various economic terms and conditions are negotiated, where at the local levels, they will deal more with negotiating the local operational aspects of the collective bargaining agreement. Bargaining when financial exigencies might exist, or bankruptcies possibly, or extreme financial duress, can put negotiations into a very tumultuous spin when it comes to bargaining the various different economic provisions with wages and benefits and pensions in particular. But one of the important things to keep in mind when negotiating in tough financial times is that there's a big difference when an employer representative says, I can't deliver any financial or economic improvements, versus, well, it could be kind of problematic and I'll have to think about it. But once a negotiator says that I can't deliver any economic increases, then the interesting reaction to that is that the union does have a right to call for an examination of the financial statements of that particular corporation. So usually it's pretty wise to stay away from such statements as I can't, as opposed to saying I'd rather not see this move in this direction. Concession bargaining is another one of those unique situations where in some instances a corporation or company or employer may necessarily need to reduce the level of wages, for example, or benefits to address financial contingencies, for example, or various financial deficits that it may be challenged by, and actually would send negotiators as employer representatives to propose possibly wage and benefit reductions. This can obviously create a lot of tension and problems in the employer union negotiations process. However, it's not uncommon, particularly in larger corporations where there may be more efficiencies resident in other locations of that particular business, maybe in other parts of the country, with maybe newer and more efficient production processes that makes it much more efficient and from a cost standpoint of view, that would encourage employers to necessarily go to the table to ask for concessions from a particular union to retain business in that particular location. Lastly, a unique situation can occur when regressive bargaining occurs. And under the National Labor Relations Act and in the spirit of good faith bargaining, typically regressive bargaining refers to when you are engaged in the collective bargaining negotiation exchanges of proposals, that you come in with a proposal that was less than the most previous proposal that you made. So, for example, if you were to, have initially proposed a 3% pay increase, and maybe you moved to 3.5%, but then as a result of maybe some of the union's counter proposals, you came back and offered 2%. So that 2% was obviously much less than the last 3.5% that you had left as a proposal with the union. And typically that would quickly lead a union to accuse the employer of bad faith bargaining. Because typically, proposals or provisions, move around or improve, but seldom do they go backwards. And usually that's a sign to the union that possibly that's bad faith bargaining.